your packet is a long description of our celebrities, but Don McPherson, who's legendary, who was not only an All-American, he was an All-American quarterback from Syracuse. And I don't know if you know, but the colors of Syracuse are orange and blue. And the first county executive of Nassau was Sprague, and he made the colors of Nassau orange and blue. And so it's a legacy from Syracuse to Nassau County. A little trivia there for you. I couldn't believe that when we were looking for a good speaker, particularly on violence against women, people would say, well, you got to get Don McPherson. I said, who? Don McPherson? The coaches all know him. He's actually an incredible guy. He came in second in the Heisman Trophy voting when he was in college. I've had people who've been to his football camps years ago said he was inspirational. He changed his focus midstream to work hard again to fight violence against women, became a national speaker on it. And he's incredible. He's a local guy, but we were stunned and thrilled that when we called, said, would you maybe consider possibly be our speaker? He said, absolutely. And it's been a pleasure ever since in the conversations that we've had. So at this point, I'm very proud and pleased to announce and bring to you Don McPherson.
Good morning. How are you? So this is really weird. Because I've spent most of my life doing this. I'm from West Hempstead, and thank you. I needed that. And so, first of all, I hate microphones and I hate stages and microphones because I always wanted to be an entertainer. So this is frustrating for me because I feel like I want to start singing or telling jokes, and neither are appropriate. But people always ask me when I do this, and I speak constantly. I've been on about 16 college campuses since August. And yeah, and I always get asked the question if I'm nervous, and I always am, and I'm petrified. And this morning, more so than I think ever before, because I grew up here. I played my last high school football game at CW Post, and before that, here at Hofstra. And I want to be motivational this morning. I want to be aspirational, but it's hard. It's hard when we talk about what we're going to spend the day talking about. And it's hard for me to be here. I purposefully did not shave, and I wanted the gray because some people in this room know me from when I had all black hair. And I see the chuckles in the back. But I'm wearing my Chucks, so that's kind of making me relevant. And thinking about the conversations that we've been having, right, with Athletes Helping Athletes, 30 years ago, in talking to young people about different social issues and all the work that we've done on bullying for so many years, and hazing. I'm looking at Elaine and Patty, and all the work that we've done over the years. And sometimes it feels like we're not making progress. Sometimes it feels, and we were talking a little while ago, Elaine and Patty and I, about how we have done so much work and we have made so much progress. And we get taught and told these narratives that are not true. We are not a divided country like people want you to. And I believe that is a media-driven narrative that sells papers, and it says it pits MSNBC against Fox, and so they get their ratings and they get their people. We are not. I'm a black man from New York. I told you I've been on 16 campuses in the last few months. Small towns, big cities, all over this country. I go in a small town, I rent a car, and I drive across a very conservative, what's considered a conservative state. I'm not met with anger or violence. I'm met with love and appreciation for coming to the community to have a conversation. We are not as divided as people want us to believe we are. I look in this room, I see a tremendous amount of diversity of people who are working hard to make a difference. And so I say to you at the very beginning of this, because I may go in a direction that may sound a little dour, that may sound a little defeatist in some ways about where we are and what we need to do and what I hope to do. And I spent so much of my life as someone raising awareness. Now I feel like I need to be an accelerant on the conversations that we're all trying to have, but we need to have a little different, very specific conversation that we have lacked. And so what I hope that you all get out of this is a sense that we are moving in the right direction, that we are making progress. And I would say this especially to people who are my age and a little bit older. I'm 53 years old, just for frame of reference. That we need to have a different kind of conversation. We need to have a more honest conversation. We need to stop using and doing the things that got me involved in doing this work. So I'll give you just a little quick background of how I got involved in doing this kind of program. As Rene said, so many people know me as a former football player, which, by the way, was about 24 years ago. So you gotta stop saying former, right? That was just way too long ago. But most people still know me as that because they want to. That's comfortable, that's easy, that feels good. They don't want to hear the fact that I'm a feminist and I'm an activist in the prevention of all forms of men's violence against women. They don't want to hear that I'm out confronting misogyny, sexism, homophobia, patriarchy. They don't want to hear that I'm trying to promote and push a more open, honest conversation about sexual behavior. They don't want to hear those things. We don't want to talk about those things that are uncomfortable. That's how I got involved in doing this work. Not because something happened to me or because I was inspired by anything. I was a football player, period. I got asked to be a part of a program in New York State when I was a sophomore at Syracuse University called Athletes Against Drunk Driving. Program started by Governor Cuomo so many years ago. And the reason why I was asked to go out and talk to students too young to drink and too young to drive was because adults did not want to talk honestly with young people. So we use prevention language and scare tactics. This is your brain on drugs. Y'all remember that one? Right? How many of your schools for over the years would still, probably to this day, drop that mangled wrecked car in front of the school and say, if you drink and drive, these are the consequences. That mangled car, that prevention language, that scare tactics, they don't work. I was part of the Just Say No generation of drugs. My best friend in high school was my wide receiver. I was a quarterback. He was my wide receiver in football. We were together all the time. Everyone thought we were brothers. I always tell people we were brothers. We were brothers. You know what I'm talking about. We both had big afros, right? Because it was the early 80s. My best friend started selling cocaine when we were seniors in high school. How do you just say no? How do you just walk away? How do you just wait? Which one is just wait? Sex, thank you. Sometimes I ask the question, which one is just wait? It's just like, we're scared to say it. We are afraid to say it. We want to talk about it. Here's what I want you all to know, that when I say we're not divided, we are divided generationally. Because as adults, we're still afraid to say sex. And young people are inundated with sex. And we're still using we refer to prevention language and scare tactics. Just say no, just walk away, all that, that's the prevention language. The scare tactics are that mangled car. The scare tactics on sex is one that we do not want to talk to you. We want to talk about sexual violence, but we don't want to talk about sex. We don't want to talk about the good stuff. Right? So we tell young people that sex is dirty, immoral, it's going to cause unwanted pregnancies, STIs, all these horrible things, but save it for the one you love. We don't even want to talk about the good stuff. It's all these horrible things, but save it for that special person. So that prevention language and scare tactics keeps us from having more meaningful conversations because we think we checked the box or we think that we talked about it. And I tell college students, and I've been saying this for the past few months, because it's funny to me, but it's also true. And that is the secret that I tell them that adults don't want young people to know. And I know there are a couple young people here, so close your ears. I'm gonna tell you a secret that your mom don't want you to know. Sex is amazing. You brought him here. You don't have to, you know. It is wonderful. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's 50. And we don't talk about that. We're afraid to talk about that. And because we're afraid to talk about it, and here's at the end of the day, who's hurt by our silence as adults are young people. Because sex without love, without communication, that's done without respect, that's done in a manipulative way, is a 50 bad. First of all, it ceases to become sex, and it's something different. And because of our silence as adults, all we end up dealing with is the 50 bad. And we're not helping young people make good decisions with good information. And so part of what I want to challenge you on, this is, to, as I say, to be an accelerant in the conversation, and I just thought of that term this morning as I was driving here, because I was wondering and thinking to myself, who's gonna be in this room? Is it gonna be the people, is it gonna be Dom and Pat, who I've known for 30 years and have been having these conversations, and are there gonna be young people who are fired up to do this work? It's a little bit of a mixture. And there's probably more men in here than I'd say in the past, but still, probably 80% women. And so the two things that I'm going to challenge you on this morning, and the ways in which we look at issues around violence, in particular violence against women, is one, is the need to address men and masculinity in a way that we have not previously. That's going to make a lot of men in this room uncomfortable, I hope. Because we do not act unless we're uncomfortable. If you leave this day, and you don't leave this day shaking and pissed off, then I would say, Rene, you got teed up again. And the second part, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I am going to give you a warning about it, what I think is one of the greatest public health crises that we're not even mature enough as a country to talk about, and that's sex. And I'm not going to get into, you don't have to cover his ears too much more. She's like, oh, Lord. So just to give you some background on the issue of what I refer to as men's violence against women, and why I refer to as men's violence against women, and why it's so important that we engage men in this conversation in a very different way. But I just want to pause for 1 second before I get into this to make a point of the consequences of our silence. And this is particularly hard for a lot of reasons, primarily because some of the examples I'm about to share with you, people in this room were directly affected by it. One of the things that we have to come to terms with as a society, as an American culture, is that we watched children, depending on, bless you, how you think of what children are, we watch babies be slaughtered in what is supposed to be, anyone who's ever been in elementary school knows that the first thing that happens in elementary school with educators in that environment is to make it a safe place, to make it a place that's an extension of home. And we watched children in that environment get slaughtered. We didn't do much. We just got used to it. We got used to it so much so that, consider this, when we think about how wonderful we are as a country, that a 97-year-old woman who survived the Holocaust, a 97-year-old woman who survived the Holocaust was murdered in her synagogue for being a Jew in Pittsburgh. That's us. Until we get fucking pissed off about that, I apologize for that, but it every time I say it, it sounds more and more absurd. Why? How are we not sitting doing something about that? How is that not a part of our national dialogue? How is that not a part of every friggin' discussion that we have every single day? A 97-year-old woman who survived the Holocaust was killed in Pittsburgh for being a Jew. So, we have to change the discussion. This is no longer about awareness. We have to change the discussion to action. We have to engage in a way that we've never had before. And this is most importantly, the reason why. Our children are watching. And I can tell you, when I said it a minute ago, that we are divided not by in the ways in which we are led to believe that we are divided, whether it's red or blue or politically or all this other kind of nonsense. We're divided generationally. Because young people are watching. They've been exposed to so much more. They're so much more accepting of others. They're so much more able to talk about things that we as adults are still incapable of saying out loud. And so you know what they realize? We're full of shit. And so they stop trusting what we have to say. We have to be involved in this conversation in a much different way. And I will tell you that I came to, when I said to you, I came to this work because of the drunk driving program. I worked for a number of years with a program called Athletes Helping Athletes, organization called Athletes Helping Athletes here on Long Island, training high school student athletes to go into elementary schools for a number of years. Did that for about 18 years and then went to Northeastern University. I was playing football during those years. And I went to Northeastern University to the Center for the Study of Sport and Society. And I retired from football to go to Northeastern in Boston and work with a guy named Richard Lapchick. And I went to work with Richard Lapchick because of primarily, I wanted to expand the work that I was doing around social issues and learn a little bit more about, around social issues. But I also went to work with Richard Lapchick because he's a white man who does work around issues of racism in sport. His father, some of you may be familiar with Richard's work as an activist and as a social justice leader now. Some of you also may be familiar with his name because his father was a guy named Joe Lapchick. And Joe was the first head coach and general manager of the Knicks in the NBA. He's a member of the NBA Hall of Fame. He was considered one of the first big men of basketball. And as the first head coach and general manager of the New York Knicks, in 1950 signed a player named Nat Clifton, first African-American player to be signed in the NBA. And there was Joe Lapchick, this iconic man, this sports hero here in New York City, who the day before he signed this contract was Richard Lapchick's hero, his little boy, Richard, who was just a little boy at the time. His father was his hero, his father was everything to him. And the next day, his father was still everything to him, but everyone else in New York, his father was public enemy number one. He was getting death threats. There were bomb threats at the Knicks games. Richard Lapchick heard people threaten his father by saying, "Nigger lover, you're going to die tonight," because he signed a black player in the NBA. So Richard Lapchick devoted, literally, from the time that he was just a young boy, was so impacted by that. And as he grew, devoted his life to the issues of racism in sports, was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, personally invited by Nelson Mandela to his inauguration because of his work in the anti-apartheid movement. And then in 1984, created the Center for the Study of Sport and Society. I went to Boston when I retired from football to work with Richard Lapchick because racism in sports was my issue. I wasn't a quarterback, I was a black quarterback. And that was the thing. So I went to work with Rich because that was my issue. And when I got there, I met this guy named Jackson Katz, who was talking about all different forms of men's violence against women. He was talking about it in a way that I had never heard anyone, much less a man, talk about the issue of men's violence against women. And he was talking about all the different categories of men's violence against women, not necessarily talking about each one in particular. And there's a reason why I call it men's violence against women, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But he was talking about all the different categories: sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, teen dating violence, all the different categories of men's violence against women having two important things in common. First and foremost, overwhelmingly, involving men committing acts of violence against women. Involving men's violence against women. And if you think about, if we're going to truly do prevention, right? Get away from prevention language and scare tactics. If we're truly going to do prevention, stopping things from happening before they happen, if we're going to have an honest conversation as well about that, we have to recognize that overwhelmingly violence, and we're going to talk about violence prevention, it's overwhelmingly male behavior. If you heard that there was another shooting, we don't even call them, we used to call them school shootings, now it's just a shooting. It could happen anywhere. If you heard that somewhere right now there was a shooter with a gun, would anyone in here assume that that person was a woman or a girl? What would our response be if we found out it was a girl? Shocked. We'd be shocked. We want to know what happened. We want to deconstruct her life. What trauma did she experience that led her, when boys do it in school violence, youth violence, gang violence, teen violence, now it's just a shooter. So if we're going to have a comment, and I just want to make a point when I say this and I challenge men in this way. we are not paying attention to the right things. We're afraid to have that conversation. Part of the reason we're afraid to have the conversation is about patriarchy, because we don't want to hold men accountable. We don't want to talk about what's going on with men. So we fall back into those convenient conversations about mental health or gun control. Women have access to guns and women have mental health problems. Why don't women do it? We have to start looking at the gender foundations of this behavior. And so the first thing that all those different categories of men's violence against women have in common is overwhelming their violence committed by men, which is why I call it men's violence against women and not just violence against women. The second thing that they all have in common is that historically they've all been considered women's issues. So here's the question to the men, and I'm going to ask questions directly to the men in this conversation. If we call them women's issues, what does that allow us as men to do? Not just shift the blame, what else? Ignore it. It's not my issue. It's not my problem. I don't think about it. I don't think about it, and I don't have to be engaged in any way. Now, there's something that I'm going to talk about in a little while called the blind spot of masculinity. And part of what I refer to as the blind spot of masculinity is our ability as men to ignore it and not have to deal with the problem is part of our privilege as men. And men get a little bent out of shape when you talk about male privilege. White people get bent out of shape when you talk about white privilege. It's something that if you something that you have, it's hard to see. I'm about to publish a book, hopefully by the middle of next year, and the first chapter of the book is Black Men with Privilege. It's hard to see the privilege that we have. I want to give you an example of what I mean by that. When we say that we as men can ignore it, it doesn't even register with us. We have the convenience of being silent, even with all the stuff that's going on in front of us. We have the convenience of being silent. Doesn't bother us. There's 100,000 women with pussy hats on in New York City. Men will say things like, well, nobody's gonna bother me. I can watch this game on the couch now. Right? Because we're not fazed by it. So here's just to give you an example of what that privilege looks like. When I was playing in the CFL, and this was long before I started doing this work, about 4 years before I started doing this work, I was living in Canada. I played in a town called Hamilton, which is between Buffalo and Toronto in southern Ontario, right on Lake Ontario. And I lived in a town called Burlington, beautiful community in southern Ontario, beautiful upscale community. And I lived right a couple blocks from the lake. And when I first got there, I stayed in a hotel, and there was a great restaurant, indoor, outdoor restaurant. It was always summer, CFL's a summer game, and there was a lot of young women who worked in this restaurant who were all friends of mine. And I was just out of college, and they were all young college age, just out of college age women. This was a cool place to hang out. And at that time, in the summer of 1991, when I got there in June, late May and early June, early that year, and during that time, was a time of one of the most horrific stretches of men's violence against women in Canadian history. I just ran into someone who's from Canada the other day at a dinner, at Vital Voices, if some people are familiar with that organization, on Monday night. And she was from Canada. I said, do you remember the Scarborough rapist, Paul Bernardo, Carla Homolka? Paul Bernardo was known as the Scarborough rapist. He raped about 18 women before he was caught. He was actually caught a couple of different times. But in 1991, he and his then wife, woman named Carla Homolka, and I apologize for giving them names, had raped and murdered and dumped the naked bodies of two young women, girls, 15, 16 years old, in Burlington, where I was living. And it happened, the two girls, was right before I got there. The first person that they murdered was her, Carla Homolka's, younger sister. This was, as I said to you, one of the most horrific cases in Canadian history. The two girls were abducted in a yellow Camaro. At least that was the description of the car. And it was one day in this beautiful restaurant where I was hanging out and just sitting around probably having a beer and a cheeseburger. The car that fit the description was in the parking lot. And the women that I knew otherwise as cheerful and engaging and gregarious had looks of horror on their face, were shaking, were moving around frantically. That look of trauma, not just like I'm scared, but imminent fear. And I remember, you know, you ever have those moments where you're enlightened about something and you remember how ignorant you once were in your life? I remember, like I said, this was long before I had any consciousness about this issue. I remember saying to these young women, "You're cool, you're okay. He's not in here, we know everybody in here." I was telling them that they were okay, they were safe. They weren't safe. There was a murder in the neighborhood. And all I could say to them was, "You're all right." And they weren't. But the reason I said that was a part of my privilege as a man. I didn't care about what I drank. I didn't care about when I walked home. I didn't care about if I locked my door. I didn't give a damn about anything. You know why? I knew he wasn't after me. It didn't affect me one bit. In fact, I kind of, wow, there's a murderer in town? That's male privilege. Just the very way in which we, and I'm gonna share something with you, the very ways in which we as men, around this issue of violence against women, the way in which we walk around the world. I'm gonna ask a question to the women, to the men, and I'm gonna ask the same question to the women. So, y'all know that symbol? That one? It's female, male. So here's a question to the men. And this goes back to this point that I just made about what I was oblivious to. What do you all do? What do you do on a daily basis to protect yourselves from being sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or raped? I see eyebrows going up. I hear nothing, zero, nada. And do we even think about it? Did you think about it when you got up this morning? What you put on? What time you're gonna come home? Where you parked? What time you're gonna go back to your car? So here's a question to the women in the room. What do you all do to protect yourselves from being sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or raped? Who was that? Go ahead. Personal alarm system? She said, know how to punch him in the throat. When I was playing in Philadelphia, I was dating a woman who was in law school at Temple, and she came to my house in New Jersey for the weekend, and she had a little weekend bag, and she came in and put the bag in the closet, and I went to move the bag at one point because it was in a way, and there were bullets in the bottom of the bag, and you find bullets, and you know, we had only been dating a little while. You know, you have to address that at some point. So I waited, you know, had a glass of wine. Probably should have waited, not had, you know, a glass of wine first. And then I said, hey, what's up with the bullets? And she said, oh, that's for the gun. Her father gave her a gun so she could go to law school. Her father gave her a gun so she could go to law school. Y'all get the point? This is rape culture. Sometimes men will get bent out of shape when we say women and people will talk about rape culture. What is rape culture? Rape culture is telling women to protect themselves against us, to do all of these things. I refer to this as the list. Do all of these things. And we know, by the way, men in this room know this, because this is what we tell our daughters. We do all these things to tell women that this is going to protect them from being sexually assaulted. And we as men, nothing. We're not even part of the conversation. We don't talk about our own behavior. That's rape culture. And the reality is, this is not going to protect women and girls in most cases of sexual assault. Overwhelming cases of sexual assault happen between people who know each other. And when in cases of rape, who know each other for more than a year. So this is also part of this false narrative of prevention language and scare tactics, like that's going to solve the problem, not going to do it. So when I met Jackson Katz and I started learning things like this and hearing this realization, like, as I said, just coming out of an environment where we didn't talk about these things. I was 29 years old. I was 29 years old before I heard this for the first time, and I heard about the issue of men's violence against women. I was also 29 years old for the first time that I considered what it meant to be a man. And here's part of the blind spot of masculinity. The people who are hurt the most by the silence are young people. And the people who are hurt the most by the silence of men to talk about issues of men's violence against women are men. And I'm going to explain why I say that in a minute. But I want to tell you how big the cost of our silence. And I'm going to say this just for people who may think with a different kind of brain, although I don't think too many of them or too many of y'all are in this room, but I want to say it for this purpose, about the impact of the silence of men that have allowed other men to be sexual predators over time. So now what we have in the response to this conversation, I'm going to come back to the conversation around masculinity in a moment, but I want to give you like a framework just so we don't get lulled into that something big is happening and that we're having a big response, because we're not. Something big is happening. The activism is doing its job. The activism of the people that I've worked with for many years, and I've been a part of and been blessed to be a part of for many years, is working. Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose, those men are being exposed, and they're paying the consequences. And someone recently, or several months ago, asked me, when is the Me Too movement going to come to higher education? It's been in higher ed. In fact, it was in higher ed long before any of this. You go back to 2011 to the Dear Colleague letter that came out of what Andrea Pino and Annie Clark did in North Carolina that inspired the film The Hunting Ground of women using Title IX as a legal lever to address the lack of adjudication and attention being paid to sexual violence on campuses. And so it's been happening, to the point that I now refer to the problem in higher education as a $1 billion problem. And the reason why I call it the $1 billion problem is I want people to understand how big it is, the impact of it. By the way, I use the word billion. Does anybody here know the difference between a million and a billion? How would you describe the difference between a million and a billion to someone like me who does not do numbers? 1,000 millions, right? A couple of people in zeros. Doesn't make sense. I heard this at a conference on philanthropy years ago, and I keep using it because it sounds really, really cool. 1 million seconds, not just cool, but it tells you how big a billion is. 1 million seconds is 12 days. It's 11 and a half days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. 1 million seconds, 11 and a half days, but we'll round up to 12. 1 billion seconds is 31 3/4 years. They're not the same thing. They're not even close to being the same thing. Right? Imagine a 12-day-old child and a 32-year-old person. Right? That 12-year-old child still laying there, peeing on himself. If I gave you $1 million right now, you might consider quitting your job. Significant. If you take Penn State, Michigan State, Baylor, and now USC, you take those 4 institutions alone, they will pay out more than $1 billion because of the silence of men that allowed other men to be sexual predators over time. Not one big incident, not one horrific incident, but allowed men to be sexual predators. It was the silence of men that allowed, and there's no other way to put it from my estimation. And so, once again, I say this as men, that we need to address this problem. And here's the thing, even though it's a $1 billion problem, we're still not talking to men. And here's the problem with the conversation around we're talking to men. Men know now that we're coming in and talking to them about toxic masculinity. And this is what, or talking about redefining masculinity, redefining manhood. That conversation is not going to work. That's part of the prevention language and scare tactics, because we're not truly talking to men about who we are as men. That would be like me as a black person coming in and talking to white people about racism and saying, you need to address that toxic whiteness. We need to redefine white people. It's not going to happen. And in this conversation, we've conflated toxic masculinity with being male. And there's an element to that conversation that is so disrespecting of who men are, and men are feeling that. We're not feeling like we're part of the conversation in a positive and proactive way. We're not feeling like we're being talked with. And what we hear, many men hear, when women say me too, many men hear me too, and I blame you. That's not what women are saying. They're just saying, that happened to me too. And you didn't know about it, because that's your privilege not to have to deal with it. And so fathers looking at their daughters and their wives and their partners and their mothers, feeling like they failed in their role to be protective. Or men are saying, I don't know what to say to women anymore. I can't talk to women anymore. Well, maybe you should probably shut the fuck up then. Seriously, I mean, like, if you know that you should not, you lost the ability to talk to somebody, you should probably check what's in your brain first. Because we're not talking with each other. And and this is the part that I want to talk about the blind spot. I refer to as the blind spot of masculinity. And this is what's really important. As I said to you a minute ago, I was 29 years old. I knew what it meant to be black, just growing up in the United States and born in 1965. I knew what it meant to be a football player when all of a sudden people started treating me as a football player. I knew what it meant to be a black football player on a predominantly white campus at Syracuse. I'm a New Yorker. I know I'm a New Yorker because I go other places and I talk like this all the time. And people are like, can you slow down a little bit? And I'm talking with my hands. I knew what it meant to be an American when I went to play in the Canadian Football League. I knew how all those different things impacted my identity. Never considered my masculinity until I met Jackson. And we started talking about this issue of men's violence against women. And so I had to consider what it meant to be a man. I had never done that before. Once again, part of my privilege. Don't have to consider my identity, the most important part of my identity. In fact, I always say that my life has been more adversely affected and more impacted by my gender than by my race. I have white people go, how is that possible? You're black. So part of that is, so I asked a question, so that's not me, to the men, once again, because this is what I had to do when I heard this conversation from Jackson. And I'm gonna do this real quick and then I wanna come back to the conversation around sex, but I wanna do this real quick to put this up here. Men in the room, when you were a little boy, go back as far in your memory as you can go to when you were a little boy, in the innocence of your childhood. What was the worst insult you could hear as a little boy? I'm asking the man. Say Rene. You're like a girl. Anything like a girl. You throw like a girl, you run like a girl. Don't be. I always say that we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be women or gay men. Because we're always telling boys not to be. Don't be a sissy, don't be a faggot. So we use homophobic and sexist language to tell boys what to be. Right? And so the first thing that happens when we say this to a boy is, and this is why I say go back in your memory to the innocence of our childhood. Have you ever seen the film The Sandlot? Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite movies, right? In that film, there's a scene where these two groups of boys confront each other. And they start throwing all kinds of insults back and forth. You're a scrub, you're an embarrassment to the game, all these kind of insults. And then finally one of them says, you play ball like a girl. And the music stops, right? It's the ultimate insult. You can call a guy, that's my dog, he's a cool cat, he hits like a truck, he's got pipes. You can refer to a guy as an inanimate object or an animal, and it's a compliment. But you compare us to our sisters, and it's the ultimate insult. It's what leads to fights. You ain't call me no pussy. You don't call me a bitch. It leads to violence. I always say that people say men are not sensitive, women are more sensitive. Men are way more sensitive, way more sensitive, way more sensitive and emotional. That you call a guy a sissy and watch how he reacts to the point of violence. Because he is so sensitive, because what he's guarding is what I refer to as narrow masculinity. He's guarding this very, very sensitive thing. It's almost impossible as a human being to maintain because it's unnatural. Because the first thing that we hear, when we hear you throw like a girl, the first thing we hear is the man up. So men, this is a question to the men. What are we supposed to be as men? Shout it out. Fearless. About what? About everything. You could be, I'm asking the man, you could be laying in bed with, you could be laying in bed with your wife or your girlfriend and there'll be a noise in the house and she'll say, did you hear that? I'm like, no, I didn't hear it, did you? Go check it out. You go check it out. You heard it. Why do I have to go? I'm going to do the same thing you're going to do. I'm going to scream, come here, call 911. Right? So we have to be tough, strong, fearless men. Protector. I'm asking them. Huh? Okay, so I want to make this point because this is a really, really important point of what I said at the very beginning. That we have to have an honest discussion about this. And one of the problems with where we are in this conversation, I was asked to do this work by women. I was invited into this work to address issues of men's violence against women by women. And what those women wanted me to do was to use my privilege that I've talked about and use my status as some football player to talk to men about dismantling that which gives us privilege. It's a pretty tricky place to be. And we as men continue, so to the point that you said they don't know, they don't. We do know. We don't want to talk about it. You know what? That's our privilege, just remain silent. And here's the thing, we'll remain silent and you'll answer for us. Right? No ownership. You know who's hurt the most by that? Young men who believe this bullshit. Who believe this is it. That's who's hurt the most by it. If you're all a group of high school boys, and I ask that question, they would give me the same shit. And I call it that because that's what it is. Being tough, being strong, fearless. And by the way, we're good with that. If I just stop right there, there'd be three things. And I'm going to tell you this about what the problem with this is. And why I say that the people who are hurt most by that, I'm going to kind of jump into something real quick because I want to. This is something known as the box of masculinity. It was created by the Oakland Men's Project back in the mid-'70s, a group of men in Oakland who, again, were invited into this conversation by women to look at, to engage men around issues of masculinity in order to prevent men's violence against women. And this box that I refer to as the box of masculinity, is part of how we define, or how I define, narrow masculinity. I don't talk about toxicity of masculinity or toxic masculinity, because in reality, there's nothing wrong with this. There really isn't. The problem is when this is the only thing you can be. And so the problem with this box, and that's why I said that men would just go, hell, I'm good with that. And we're missing a conversation that is so critical about who we are as men. And it's the truth about who we are as men. We're not wrong and we're not bad because this is what we do. We're wrong and we're bad when we're not telling the truth about who we are. We are sensitive, we are vulnerable, we are passive, we are submissive, we are empathetic. And when we don't tell that truth, we help young men think that's okay. As I said, if there's a group of high school boys, they would give me the same thing that a group of, and I was at a school once and I had a football team one night. The next day I was with PhDs and professors and counselors and advisors at the same school, and I asked the same question to the men in the room, and I got this. And one of the things about this is that and as I said, we've conflated toxic masculinity with being male, is that we're telling men that we need to stop doing this. This is redefine masculinity, get away from this. There's nothing wrong with this. The way that I define this is not so much as this box that we as men have to get out of, or we have to deny, or we have to denounce. But we have to look at it differently to help us make better decisions with the wholeness of who we are. How many of you have a toolbox at home? Raise your hands really high if you have a toolbox at home. Good, I just want to see how many people actually have toolboxes. So let me ask you this question. How many of you use all the tools in the toolbox? Right? You use about 4 or 5 things in the top, and you carry around this toolbox all the time. You gotta fix a light bulb, you go, oh, I gotta carry this whole box. Right? You use like the 3 things at the top, a hammer, screwdriver, and duct tape. Right? And the rest of the time you carry around this box. And this is the thing about who we are as men. We are caring, loving, sensitive, passive, submissive, empathetic. We're carrying that shit around with us all the time. But we fall back to this. And so it's not so much that we as men have to get rid of this, is that we have to start living whole lives. And we as men have to start helping younger men live their wholeness. And in that wholeness, in teaching them how to deal with, to live in that wholeness, to expand an understanding of who we are as men, we get to the fundamental teachings that lead to men's violence against women. Because the way that masculinity is policed and the way that this box is maintained, if a guy steps outside this box, what kind of language does he get called? Say it. Okay. What else? Men. What's the purpose of the language on the outside of the box? Say it. Keep you in the box. So this is what we as men do to each other. In order to maintain this understanding of masculinity, we use homophobic, sexist language to push men back inside this box and say, be a real man. As I said to you before, the people who are hurt most by that are younger men. And I'm going to come back to that point again about how we need to have a more broader conversation, because the way that this is maintained is by sexist and homophobic language, which is exactly what you throw like a girl is. The first message that boys hear at that age is to man up. At a very innocent age. The second message we're hearing implicit in that statement or that challenge, you throw like a girl, is you're saying that women and girls are less than. It would not be an insult otherwise. It wouldn't be a challenge. If you believe that another group of people are less than, you're going to disregard their feelings, disregard their rights, abuse their feelings, abuse their rights. You're going to completely ignore what's happening to them because they don't matter. We teach that every single day with that kind of language. And here's the other thing that comes out of that. So I'm gonna jump forward for a minute, just to not jump forward, but kind of tell you what I do when I talk to college men. I'll pick out a couple of men in the room when I'm doing this about what it is to be a man, what we're supposed to be. And I ask, tell me your name? Peter. And you are? Josh. I say, Peter and Josh and I are hanging out. We're in college, so we're hanging out, and we decide that we're going to go after working out, and we're on the same team, and we decide we're going to go get a burger, and we go to this place, Peter and Peter, right? And Josh. And we're in this little bar, right? And after a while, lights go down, and there's a woman on the other side of the room, and Peter, she's, you know what I mean? He laughed, he smiled. He's like, all I have to do is raise my eyebrows and shake my head really fast, and that's like, she's fine, right? We know. So I say to Peter, I'll be right back. I'm just going to go talk to her for a few minutes. I go talk to her for 40, 45 minutes. I come back. I tell Josh, I'll be right back. I'm just going to walk her to her car. Because remember those things that we're supposed to do, right? Protect the patriarchy. We're not supposed to let you go to the car by yourself, right? So I walk her to the car, and I don't come back. The next day when I see them, what are they going to ask me? Mom, you might want to, this might be a good time to get some coffee. So here's what I want to share with you about that response. And like I said, I'm not going to go in, but the general response is that we had sex, right? Remember I told you before, we don't want to talk about it. But without getting into all that, here's the reasons why I created that scenario. The first one is the automatic assumption. By the way, in that scenario, I talked to that woman for 45 minutes. Remember before, I don't use that prevention language saying it's going to cause unwanted pregnancies and STIs. But if you think 45 minutes is enough time to hook up with someone, you're making a bad decision. And we're not saying that to them either. We're saying nothing. So they think 45 minutes is a long time. I'm telling you, men and women, what are you doing over there all that time? The second thing is the language. And I will tell you the language that we use to talk about the most wonderful, beautiful, amazing, incredible, fundamentally human things that we do is to be intimate with one another, physically intimate. And we refer to it as, did you hit that? Did you beat? Did you smash? Did you fuck? The language is violent. It's dehumanizing. She becomes a piece, a sum, and an it. And I always, whatever I'm writing with, that's an it, that's a piece. I don't care what happens to that piece. I have another piece right here. I have more of it in my bag. That's why the first thing that Ben hears when you say you feel like a girl is to man up. The second message implicit in that statement, we hear that women and girls are less than. She's just a piece. And so we're not even talking about, as I said before, teaching young people to and this is where the challenges that we have, and I go back to this before, what I said at the very beginning of this, the challenges that we have to have an honest discussion are so right in front of us if we choose to look honestly about it. But it's going to take courage. It's going to take courage. And if we don't have the courage, like I said, if you're fine with a 97-year-old woman being killed because of who she worships, how she worships, then we should just continue to be silent. Because in our silence, we are watching the problem. We are not having this conversation about how our children should learn how to be responsibly and lovingly intimate with one another. And in our silence, in the absence of our having an honest discussion with them, they're not ignoring the problem. I remember years ago when I have two daughters that are 12 and 14 years old, and it's been a challenge. Not a challenge in the way that you might be laughing. It's been a challenge to live in a culture that does not want to talk honestly with them about who they are as people. I remember when I was on the beach with a business partner of mine. We were down, I don't know, one of the beaches, and a buddy of mine had two girls the same age, and he was looking at them, and we were looking at our girls. They were like, at the time, 5 and 7. They were playing in the sand, and he said, oh man, this is going to be hard. I'm like, what's going to be hard? When they get older. Or, I hate when people say you have daughters and you have to get a gun. Really? So you've objectified my daughter already? You're telling me that I have to get a gun? I'm gonna have to kill somebody? This is the trap that we as men fall into, that protective patriarchy. The same man who says to his son, look after your mother, take care of your mother, protect your mother, is the same man who tells another man, take care of my daughter. We never escape that understanding that that's what we're supposed to be. That's not gonna protect them. So I said to my buddy, man, I want my daughters to have an amazing sex life. I want them to do everything and with whom they choose. And I want it to be beautiful and loving and safe. I'm not gonna get there if we're silent. I'm not gonna get there just hoping that happens. We have to be deliberate, we have to be intentional, we have to be graphic, we have to be honest, and it needs to be sustained. Because the question that I ask young men and students of all ages now, how many of you from the people that raised you, I ask you all in this room, from the people who raised you got a graphic, honest, and sustained conversation about your bodies and intimacy and sexual behavior? Raise your hand. 2 people, 3 people, and a couple of, So here's a question to everybody else in this room. Where'd you get it? If you didn't get it from the people who taught you please and thank you, yes ma'am, no sir. If you didn't get it from them, where'd you learn about it? TV? TV. TV barely exists, right? Now anymore. It's like everything. Now it's Netflix. What else? School. Graphic, honest, and sustained. Was school graphic? Now it's a diagram of this. And the girls got something, the boys went and play soccer. Think about that. People in the street, just like random people. Right? Yo, dude, what's up? You know what a clitoris is? Right? There are people in the streets with random stuff. I'm sorry, Mom, but this is, you good. Okay, she's like, that's fine. Where else? Friends. How much of your friends actually know? Not much. They weren't very helpful. Man, any men want to share where first time you learned about sex and saw sex? And thank you. Horn. When I was 12 years old, my best friend was 14. His older brother was 19. I grew up in Lakeview in West Hempstead. And his brother was 19. Said, if you get to the Limerick movie theater, y'all know the Limerick movie theater? Right by, what's the pizza place across the street? Right? So the Limerick movie theater that my best friend told us, his brother said, if you get there, you can get to see a movie called Emmanuel in Bangkok. Right? Elaine, you just told on yourself. You're like, I know that movie. Right? So we walked, and I walked from Lakeview to Limbrook to see Emmanuel and Mary, right? To see Emmanuel, because I was 12 years old and I was curious. It was before the internet, it was before cell phones, before all that kind of stuff, and I heard enough about this thing, sex, that I was curious enough to walk 2.5 miles, or 2 miles, because I heard enough, I was curious enough. And I went and saw this film, Emmanuel and Babcock, but by today's standards, it was nothing. It was the same movie theater where I saw Jaws and the Aristocats, right? With my family. So it wasn't like I was in some back alley, red light district place. And I walked. And you know what? When I left that whole thing in that movie theater. Today, on this thing, it's not Emmanuel in Bangkok. And it's not a 1.5 mile walk away. And it is graphic, it is sustained, and in the absence of adults talking, which we still are not, it becomes the truth. It becomes what sex is. And so when I ask that question of college students, I asked that question for about 20 years. If you didn't get it from your parents, where'd you get it? We eventually get to porn. But in the last 2 years, it went from the internet and pornography to the hub. Y'all know what I mean when I say the hub? If this room were 10 times more of you, of college students, if I walked outside of here and talked to a student on this campus at Hofstra, I said, in the context of this conversation, and I said, do you know what the hub is? It's Pornhub. And if you don't know what Pornhub is, as an adult, so 10 years ago, I used to tell adults to use that, remember that duct tape? To duct tape yourself to a chair and watch MTV for 3 hours. You will break yourself through that duct tape. Now I say to you, just go look at what Pornhub is. And this is how I define it, it's rape by category. And to college students, it's just the hub. But it's any way you want to see the hit, the bang, the beat, in any variation. And here's the problem. There are many. That so many of us in this work, and I studied the work of a woman named Gail Dines for many years, who's an anti-porn activist and probably one of the foremost anti-porn activists in our country, who's been talking about the violent misogyny and pornography and how it impacts women. We're not even close and mature enough as a culture. This is why I say that it's a severe public health crisis, to talk about how it's impacting young boys. Because young boys in the single digits have access and are learning about it. And in the silence of adults, that becomes their understanding. This is the problem I have with the whole concept of consent. Because we're not talking about what we should want in intimacy and relationships. And so what are boys getting consent for? They're just getting, consent is a legal term. We're just getting permission. Now you have guys on college campuses sending a text on Monday, hey, you want to hook up on the weekend? And the woman says, yeah, I'll hook up with you on the weekend. Yeah, I want to get together. That sounds like a good time. And they got it on their phone. They think they have consent. To do what? They have consent to do what they've seen in porn. When a young boy is watching porn, what do you think he's watching? He's not watching a woman. He's watching a man. And we continue to be silent. That's what they're learning. That's where they're getting it from. And I am actually sympathetic to college men, especially now, because we're just indicting them on the things that we failed to teach them and that they grow up seeing as the norm. And we're not having a respectful conversation enough with them to help them make good decisions, to start talking about things that we are all uncomfortable with. In our silence, that's what's happening. I can't even say what's going to happen. That's what's happening. And we spend a lot of time talking about the aftermath. So a lot of time talking about what happens after the fact and how we adjudicate the crime. And if we're truly going to do prevention work, and this is what bothers me about, I've been working in higher ed, and as I said, all the campuses I've been on this year, I've been working in higher ed for 24 years on this issue, talking to college students about men's violence against women and masculinity and all this. And we're still not having a significant conversation. We are still using prevention language and scare tactics. We're still using the activism model and not an education model. We're still doing, and a prime example of this activism model against an education model is every college campus does Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Sexual Assault Awareness Month is a whole bunch of resources and speakers and campaigns and Take Back the Night and all these things that we've been doing for 40 years. That spend the entire month, the last month before students leave for 4 months. The month when they're concerned with final exams, with graduation, with summer internship programs, with summer vacation, the sun finally comes out on a lot of campuses. And we spend that month talking about the problem, not talking about solutions, talking about the problem. Sexual Assault Awareness Month should happen in August, and it should be every day. And it should be a part of our regular conversations because students are hooking up and talking to each other on a regular basis. So when we have problems in the math department, do we go and just talk to people who don't know how to do math? No. We teach every single day. And one of the things about sports that really bothers me in this conversation is that we look at sports. Remember, it's easy to talk about the bad things. It's easy to talk about the athletes who transgress. What we don't look at is the things that sports teaches us is just like the classroom. You prepare to make good decisions. With good information, you look at yourself honestly, you self-scout, where am I weak, where am I strong, who's around me, do they make me better? What do we know from research, what do we know from scouting? We do all of that to talk about how to make good decisions. But here on this very critical issue, we say nothing. Here on this issue where the activism is telling us that it's a workplace issue. All right, if it's a workplace issue, then who better to prepare young people for the workplace than higher education? And we're not doing it. We're not looking at it that way. We're looking at it as a liability, not as a responsibility. And so we have to start applying the same things we know that help people get better to this conversation and not get drawn into what we've always done. That's a hard thing to do. But I want to leave you with this one last piece of this, and this is not a happy one last piece of this. And I said this, that the people who hurt most about the silence are men. And I want just to complete this conversation. I mentioned male privilege. And what that privilege allows us to do is to ignore the problem, not be a part of the conversation. And in doing so, we're not, as men, growing. We're out of the conversation, we're safe, we don't have to deal with it. But we're not growing. And the only way I can describe it, and the NFL has had all of its problems over the last couple of years, and there's been all kinds of things with domestic violence and sexual assault and concussions and CTE, everyone wants to link the two. It's kind of like, the gun control mental health issue, right? It's like this easy fix. Well, man, these guys are messed up because of all the hits to the head. I played about 17 years of my life, I played football. I got concussions all the time. There were times I was unconscious for several minutes at a time. My brother who also played in the NFL, who runs a mega church in San Diego, once said, hey, how many concussions have you had? I said, define concussion. You saw stars every day. Every day for most of my football playing days. It's not that simple. There's something else going on. And we need to pay attention to what's going on the same way we need to pay attention to the fact that overwhelmingly the shooters are male and white men. There's a guy named Chris Gedney. Chris was a high school American tight end in Liverpool High School, just outside of Syracuse, next town over. He was a high school American tight end in Syracuse. I got to play a little catch with him when he was a senior in high school. I was a senior in college. He came to Syracuse. I went to the NFL. Chris came to Syracuse, college All-American at Syracuse. Then played in the NFL for a number of years with Chicago Bears and the Arizona Cardinals, had a great NFL career, retires from football, comes back to Syracuse, married his college girlfriend, who was also a student athlete at Syracuse, had 4 children, living in his hometown, working at the university. He was the senior associate athletics director for Major Gifts. In other words, he was out there raising money. A couple of years ago, we were involved in a $1 billion capital campaign. So I was doing some consulting work living down here on Long Island and meeting with Chris and other guys that I worked with and went to school with at Syracuse, raising money. Trying to raise $1 billion. There's that word again, $1 billion for the university. Table of 10 at Del Frisco's, having a great time. Ask Chris, how you doing? Hey, Chris, how you doing? Living the dream, Donnie, living the dream. He was the announcer for the football team. Traveled with the team, called games, hometown hero, making good money, famous, good-looking, tall, white, cisgender, heterosexual man. Back in March, Chris put a shotgun to his head and killed himself. He's the 32nd guy that I know, that I played with, that I was contemporaries with, that I know. Not guys I read about, oh, I remember that guy. Guys I know who played football in the NFL who are dead. 32. None of them made 50. It's not CTE. It's the things that we don't want to talk about. When I got the call about Chris Gedney, I was actually at a football dinner in Atlantic City about to present the award to the best player in college football last year. I'm walking out of my hotel and a guy calls me up who's been telling me for a couple of years that Chris is going to be the next funeral I go to. So I get the call and I'm immediately, one of the first calls I made was to a guy who lives here on Long Island who was Chris's agent when he played. And I told him what happened. And the first thing out of his mouth was, man, Donnie, that divorce really killed him. I said, Howie, that divorce was 10 years ago. So for 10 years, you watched your friend in decline. 10 years, you knew that he was hurting. This is what I refer to as the blind spot of masculinity. There's two sides to it. Because Chris had drug problems, because he was taking painkillers, and that led to one thing, and he was self-medicating, and alcohol on top of that. He got divorced. That hurt him. Financially, emotionally, he was a hometown hero. He was depressed. He had anxiety. He felt less than a man because he wasn't doing those things for his family. All those things compounded. And so many of the men, and so here's what Chris didn't do. He didn't say, I need help. Not, I need help that moment when he had a shotgun in his hand and he was walking towards the bedroom. That moment when things started to get bad. He couldn't say, I can't do this. I need help. I'm struggling. I'm lost. He couldn't say those things. That silence is what I refer to as the blind spot of masculinity, because all those things gave him privilege. All those things gave him privilege. All those things made him a warrior. They're also what made him weak and incapable. So in our silence of allowing men to not have this conversation about masculinity because we don't want to confront it, we're ultimately making them weak. And here's the other part of the blind spot. Is all the people around Chris Gedney would say, what could possibly be wrong with Chris Gedney? He's got it made. He's got all that privilege. And that's the part where we disrespect men, where we don't realize that we are hurting, that we are struggling. To be loving and caring, to express it, and to be vocal about it. Because we in this room don't even say it. So I said at the very beginning of this that I hope to be an accelerant in this conversation, that we start to change the conversation, start to have a more bold and brave conversation. So that we're giving young people more information to make better decisions. I am blessed in the privilege that I have to do what I do. You're all going to hear from people today who are here for a different reason. They're here because they've experienced the impact of our silence. And so when you hear their stories and you hear their voices and you hear their pain, don't think of it as a condition of humanity. Don't think of it as a condition of where we are as a country. See it as something that should tell you we need to change the conversation. We need to be braver in the conversation. They are not the solution. They are telling us that something is wrong and we need to do things differently. I hope you all have, and I said at the very beginning, I hope that you all have an amazing day and that the needle is moved and that we continue to do this work. And I will tell you what I said at the very beginning, don't underestimate the impact of the work that you all have done and continue to do so and see me as an ally in that work. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. God bless you.